My self-reflection and realization regarding my medical studies and research notes Part 1, number 1619, the 1st of May 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, Category, Methodology, Personal Science. Vascular Reliability Engineering. Special note, this research journal is based on my personal research using data from my own body and is provided for educational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice and should not be interpreted as guidance from medical professionals. Introduction. Origin of my TSI model. Since early March of this year of 2026 in Hawaii, I created my own stroke risk warning proxy of triggering sensitivity index TSI-Stroke or TSI-3B. Readers can go to the Appendix Section of TSI-Stroke to understand its equation and meaning. From the TSI value, I can immediately identify whether the warning source comes from my glucose or my blood pressure. This TSI proxy highlights that my model is a hybrid, where I use deterministic mathematics to manage a stochastic life. Reflection 1. Deterministic comfort versus stochastic reality. Have come to realize that I am confronting what I would call the original sin of both engineering education and clinical research, the comfort people have with predictability. Over time, I began to understand why deterministic methods, such as clear cause and effect relationships, like Newton's law of motion, F equals ma, remain the primary language taught in engineering schools, while stochastic methods, which deal with probability, randomness, and noise, are treated as secondary topics. The underlying reason is not purely technical. It is about how systems justify certainty and manage liability. Reflection 2. Engineering safety factor versus probability thinking. In engineering, everything was built on the concept of a safe factor. If a bridge needs to hold 100 tons, it is designed to hold 300. This reflects a deterministic mindset. If I followed rules, the bridge will not fall down. In contrast, a stochastic view would say there is a very small probability that the bridge could fail on any given day. Engineering schools prefer the deterministic approach because it creates a clean right or wrong structure that can be graded, certified, and enforced. However, in the real world, especially in the human body, the system is not totally clean or entirely predictable. It is full of noise. What I have seen in my own TSI-3B data is that managing this noise is far more important than solving for a single variable, yet it is much harder to teach. Reflection 3. Medical research. Probability used, then hidden in medical research. I have also observed a similar pattern. Researchers use probability and statistical tools to prove that a drug works better than a placebo across a population. But once that research is completed, the result is converted back into a deterministic instruction, such as taking a fixed dose every day, like 1,000 milligrams of metformin each day for diabetes. In other words, probability is used to find the truth, but then hidden from the patient to ensure compliance. My model does not follow that approach by introducing an amplified warning proxy. Like TSI-Stroke, I acknowledge that risk accumulates over time. The probability of failure, such as a stroke, is not static. It increases as exposure increases and continues. In that sense, I am not treating health as a simple biological system, but more like a reliability engineering problem where long-term stress leads to eventual failure. Reflection 4. Computational cost versus educational inertia. Another reason for this difference lies in computational cost and intellectual convenience. Deterministic models are simpler to comprehend by most people. You just input certain values, such as blood pressure and glucose, and you get an answer of stroke risk level. Stochastic models are more demanding. They require many simulations to understand the range of possible outcomes. Historically, universities did not have the computational power to teach these methods broadly. By the time computing power became sufficient, the educational system had already been built on a deterministic foundation and did not adapt easily and quickly. Special note: this research journal is based on my personal research using data from my own body and is provided for educational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice and should not be interpreted as guidance from medical professionals. The legal system is generally uncomfortable with randomness and tends to prefer clear accountability. This helps explain why both engineering education and clinical medical practice often favor deterministic frameworks, particularly in the United States, where the influence of the legal system can strongly shape practices across many fields. Contrast: medical research relies heavily on statistical methods to model uncertainty and evaluate outcomes. Medicine, however, cannot overdesign human systems in the same way engineering can. As a result, clinical practice cannot rely on fixed safety factors. While clinicians can adjust medication dosages to increase margins, these adjustments are constrained by potential side effects and competing risks, rather than providing the large, fixed safety margins seen in engineering. For example, a steel-reinforced concrete bridge can be strengthened by adding more steel bar reinforcement or increasing concrete volume. But clinicians do not have the same freedom to arbitrarily increase medication dosages without introducing additional risks. In other words, engineering co-add material. Medicine cannot add tolerance without introducing new risks. Reflection 6. My hybrid model, a deterministic control of stochastic outcomes. In this context, I see my TSI-Stroke 3B model as somewhat unconventional. It is a hybrid system. I use a deterministic equation to manage a fundamentally stochastic reality. However, I also understand that outcomes, such as the stroke risks, are probabilistic. But I also know that the inputs, such as blood pressure, pulse pressure, and glucose, can be controlled deterministically. In this way, I am applying physics-based reasoning to stay within a safe operating region of a risk probability curve. This leads me to question whether traditional deterministic education is sufficient to describe a dynamic system like human health. Reflection 7. Stationary assumption versus non-stationary reality. As I continue to reflect, I realize that much of modern engineering and medical education is still based on an outdated mental model of the world. It assumes stationarity, meaning that conditions do not change, while the real world is clearly non-stationary and dynamic. One major limitation is the focus on single variables. Traditional research often tries to isolate one factor, such as blood pressure or glucose, and treat all other influences as noise. However, in reality, that so-called noise is often the signal. This is a precise articulation of why population-based statistics fail to capture individual system dynamics. For example, I evaluated my diabetes condition across 2 distinct periods using 2 different dominant influencing factors: medication only during 1990 to 2009 versus lifestyle control only during 2010 to 2025. Through this bold and somewhat risky self-experimentation, I gained a deeper understanding of how my diabetes behaves under different system conditions. I have also learned that what is often dismissed as noise in traditional statistical models may, in fact, be the signal of the system's key interactions. These interactions between variables are where the true risk resides. That is why I chose multiplication over addition to capture and amplify the combined effects driving stroke risk. My TSI-3B model reflects a system-level perspective, whereas traditional education tends to emphasize individual components in isolation. Reflection 8. Linear thinking versus nonlinear risk. There is also a tendency toward linear thinking. Linear equations are easy to teach and solve, but biological systems are nonlinear. When risk increases, it does not do so in a simple, proportional way. Instead, it can accelerate rapidly, similar to a phase transition in physics. What appears stable can suddenly become unstable when a critical threshold is reached. This is how I interpret the concept of a danger zone, such as my TSI stroke values reach to the level of 105 to 110. Reflection 9. Real-time data versus delayed academic publication cycles. Another limitation I see is the rejection of real-time data. Academic research operates on long cycles. Data is collected, analyzed, reviewed, and published over years. By the time findings reach textbooks, they are often outdated. In contrast, I work with high-frequency data. I observe how a single meal on an hourly scale or a short period of emotional stress on a minute scale can change the system within hours or even minutes. As demonstrated in my paper Daily Use of TSI-3B to Reduce My Stroke Risk No.1619, April 29, 2026. This type of real-time analysis is difficult for traditional systems to validate because it evolves much faster than their evaluation and validation processes. In summary, high-frequency data reveals system dynamics that traditional slow-cycle methods cannot capture. Reflection 10. Static safety versus dynamic resilience. I also see a difference between static safety and dynamic resilience. Traditional systems aim to prevent failure by keeping variables within fixed limits. My approach focuses on how the system responds when it begins to deviate, rather than forcing a flat line. I rely on closed feedback loops to guide recovery and maintain dynamic stability over time, as demonstrated in my paper No.1619. In summary, stability is achieved through feedback, not by forcing constancy. Reflection 11. Freedom from institutional constraints. Because I am not bound by institutional constraints, I have the freedom to explore my own medical research approach. I am essentially creating a digital representation of my pathophysiological system. Similar to how complex engineering systems are modeled to predict failure, this perspective is likely influenced by my academic background and industrial experience. Where rapid iteration and real-time feedback are essential, this is why my research style and methods may appear unconventional to traditional medical researchers. In summary, a system-based, real-time math, physics, and engineering approach naturally looks unconventional in a traditionally structured medical framework. Reflection 12. Population average versus individual reality. Over time, I have experienced increasing fatigue when discussing these ideas with traditional medical researchers. At various medical conferences, I often found it difficult to engage in meaningful methodological discussions with attendees. The challenge is not merely technical, it is fundamentally philosophical. Many rely on population averages to define truth, while I focus on individual system behavior. For me, the average is not meaningful. What matters is the state of my own system at a given moment. In summary, the barrier is not just methods, but underlying ways of thinking. This is part 1.